Life, the Universe, and Schrodinger's Cat. I'm willing to bet that there are at least a few of you out there who recognize the first part of that title, Life, the Universe, and. It's, of course, from Douglas Adams' classic book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, in which an alien race thousands of years ago creates a supercomputer to compute the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything. The answer, of course, turns out to be 42. An answer so mystifying to them that they go on to build the Earth as a mega computer to figure out what the question is. So that's the first part, sort of. I'll be explaining the rest of life, the universe, and everything to you over the next few minutes. But how many of you are familiar with the second part, Schrodinger's cat? A lot of us have probably heard the term in science class, but we would be hard-pressed to explain it. Well, Schrodinger's cat refers to a thought experiment first proposed by Erwin Schrödinger, an Austrian scientist in 1935, to illustrate a relatively newfangled theory of quantum mechanics that was advocated by Albert Einstein, among others. In it, a cat is placed in a sealed box with a poison that may or may not be released. Until the box is opened, there's no way to know whether the cat is alive or dead. There's only a probability of one state or the other. To explain it in a very simplified and probably inaccurate way, quantum mechanics proposes that the cat actually exists in neither state, or both states, really as nothing more than what is termed a probability wave, until the box is opened and the cat is actually observed. So that's my title, though I'm sure you're still all wondering where I'm going with this, which brings me to my subtitle. Now, as you know, every good movie or book or paper these days has a subtitle. There's Star Wars, A New Hope. There's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, and Dr. Strangelove, or How I Quit Worrying and Learned to Love the Mom. Well, mine has a subtitle as well. Life, the Universe, and Schrodinger's Cat. Will science find God before religion kills him? Will science find God before religion kills him? Well, it seems hard for me to believe, but I've been coming here to speak every 9 months or so for over 7 years. And reading through some of my previous sermons, there are two things that really stand out for me. One, you guys must be really desperate for speakers, because I know there's a doctor in front of my name, but it's not theology or philosophy. I just fix sore throats and stitch people up and stuff. But second, I can see that I, like most of us, I suppose, have been on somewhat of a spiritual journey. Now, that certainly didn't start with the first time that I spoke from this pulpit. As many of you know, I was raised in the Methodist Church, but began to question some of its basic doctrines at a fairly early age. But the study I've done in both science and theology over the past decade, some of it for these very talks, has continued to push me along a specific path. Most of that path has seemed one of deconstruction. I stopped believing in a virgin birth. I long ago gave up on the idea of Christian exclusivity. And I no longer believe in God as a theistic being, as a smart, semi-transparent, bearded old guy in a toga sitting on a cloud. And losing those beliefs, watching them drop like petals off of a dying rose, well, that could be a very scary thing, as I'm sure some of you have experienced in your own lives. What will be left? Is there nothing beyond the physical? Is morality little more than a fictional construct with evolutionary advantages? Is life only about the here and now? Now, I know many of us have experienced that deconstruction, and much of it is the result of the age of enlightenment and scientific discovery. And while it's true that with its emphasis on rationality and its relentless unveiling of previously mysterious workings of the universe, it certainly did usher in the decline of religion in our society. It could never quite finish it off. That innate human sense of something more persisted, and it still persists to some degree today, even 400 years after the apple famously busted Newton's head. God may be on life support, but contrary to what the famed 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, he isn't quite dead yet. He's still hanging on. Sadly, and oddly enough, it appears that religion itself is bent on finishing that job. Church membership, as most of you know, is in a free fall in the United States today. It's 73% when Gallup first measured it in 1937. It remained around 70% for the next 6 decades, but began a precipitous decline at the turn of the century. In 2020, for the first time ever, church membership dropped below 50%. The greatest demographic during that period, no religious preference. Now, some might argue that that's a good thing, but setting aside even the whole idea of, say, salvation, looking at it purely objectively from the standpoint of societal benefit, it clearly, on balance, is not. Multiple peer-reviewed studies have shown that church attendance leads to better outcomes in gauges of human flourishing, such as family stability, supportive friendships, charitable giving, service, and so on. A Vanderbilt study showed health benefits across the board, from blood pressure, cholesterol, to weight and blood sugar, leading to a 55% reduction in mortality in both men and women, simply from attending church. And those positive effects remain even after taking into account education, poverty, health insurance, and social support systems. Meaning, the decline in religious affiliation has and will likely continue to have a net negative impact on us as a society. Well, and so why the decline of such an obvious societal good? And not just a societal good. Why are individuals turning away from something which can offer such clear benefits to their health, well-being, and overall quality of life? Well, like most things in life, the answer is what we in medicine like to call multifactorial. There's no single reason. Many leaving the church cite the hypocrisy of its members and leaders, scandals such as pedophilia in the church hierarchy, its emphasis on money, its perception as nothing more than a judgmental, non-inclusive social club, or worse, just a big business. But I firmly believe that a good part of the blame for the slow, painful death of religion, at least Christianity, the predominant religion in Western civilization, is the nature of religion itself, its failure, and in fact, its refusal to evolve with the society. For the past 600 years, since the Protestant Reformation, there's been very little change in Christian theology. In fact, an active and increasingly nonsensical resistance to change. In an age conspicuously void of miracles, we Christians insist that a man could walk on water and heal the blind with his spit. The seas could be parted down the middle, and that pairs of every living animal on earth were once packed on an ancient wooden boat in the Middle East. In an age in which historians have repeatedly demonstrated its changing nature, its inconsistencies, and even outright contradictions, we still insist that the Bible is the immutable and infallible Word of God. In an age in which the internet instantly reveals the breadth and variety of religions, thought, and experiences that have flourished among many cultures and ages of humanity, we still insist that ours is the one and only true way. Adherents argue that all this requires is faith, but in fact the term faith has now become simply an attempt to put a virtuous facade on the act of believing things which are clearly no longer plausible. No wonder so many are abandoning religion. Religion seems hell-bent on being at odds with everything we know and are continuing to learn. So will religion kill God? Well, probably not entirely. After all, the segments of Christianity that seem to be flourishing in the United States right now are the most traditional and fundamentalist. And that might seem at odds with what I've just said, but I think there'll always be a portion of the population that, in the midst of what seems to be a more and more chaotic world,
will be looking for hard and fast rules, will be looking for the assurance of the answer. But for the most part, unless religion can pry itself out of the 16th century, I think we can count on an ever accelerating increase in those checking the no religious preference box. A society that is functionally, if not entirely, atheist. Nietzsche will prove prophetic at last. God, at least in the United States, will indeed be dead. But Nietzsche himself certainly seemed to have some misgivings about this. God is dead, he indeed wrote, but then went on. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? 140 years later, the cost of deicide can certainly be debated, but there's little doubt that society, at least Western society, is paying a price. We have become gods, just as Nietzsche predicted, at least the gods of our own lives, but petty, self-serving, and graceless gods, clearly not up to the task. With nothing above us to which to aspire, we race to be the first to feed at the bottom. Of course, there are exceptions. But as we have let go of the idea of an eternal God, there is no doubt our society has in general become more materialistic, less forgiving, more focused on the superficial and the immediate gratification of our personal rather than corporate desires. Crime, depression, broken homes, divorce, social unrest, suicide, they're all trending up with no signs of stopping, at least until the inevitable collapse. Now, of course, not all the blame for the societal deterioration we see going on around us can be laid at the feet of the rapidly increasing secularization of society. We can point to the entertainment industry or racism or income inequality or our schools or whichever side of the aisle happens to be in charge of the government at the moment. But I'm convinced that the abandonment of God, the idea of an absolute, an intimate and loving and all-encompassing and eternal truth or higher power, whatever that might be, however you might imagine that, the source of some sort of moral compass to supersede nature's brutal survival of the fittest law, I'm convinced that the abandonment of this idea will be the death not just of God, but of our society as well. And so, for some time, I've disagreed with the notion that the death of God is a good thing. I've disagreed practically. I've disagreed socially. But now I can actually disagree for another reason, one that many of you may find surprising. I can disagree scientifically. And here's where that sermon subtitle finally reveals itself fully, where the years of my religious deconstruction and years of questioning have led me. Finally, a constructive rather than deconstructive question. Will science find God? Now, how could that be? I mean, how could that be? After all, we know that the trajectory of science has been to relentlessly push God further and further into a corner, to explain away naturally all the mysteries of life and the world around us, to make him irrelevant, unnecessary, obsolete. Who or what could possibly turn that around? I mean, that would take an Einstein, wouldn't it? Indeed, it would. Or should I say, it did. The Age of Enlightenment produced a radical change in how we as humans viewed reality. We began to see the world in more objective terms, shaped by inanimate laws that could be discovered and applied within nature itself, rather than superstition or supernatural causation. But with that approach came an assumption adopted by Western thought, and probably so basic that many of us don't even realize we hold it, that there is a division between the observer and the observed. The idea that these are two distinct things. Well, the opposing view is not really a new one. Early Sanskrit and Taoist thinkers, as well as Native American cultures, taught that all is one. Eastern mystics and philosophers declared that there was a unity between the observer and the external universe. Even some Western thinkers, such as Berkeley and Spinoza, challenged the view of an external world and its separation from consciousness. Despite this, our more familiar view of a distinction between observer and the observed has remained the prevailing one, both in science and in society at large, until now. Or I should say, at least until the early 1900s, when quantum theorists, including men like Erwin Schrodinger and Einstein, first concluded that consciousness is central to any understanding of reality. And although they reached their conclusions through advanced math, the subsequent decades of research in quantum mechanics have only reinforced this verdict and moved it slowly to the mainstream of scientific thought, if not yet the thought of the lay community. Early experiments that you may have heard of, such as the famous double slit experiment, for example, showed us that a photon of light behaves as both a particle and a wave, and neither, depending on how it is being observed. As Niels Bohr, the great Nobel Prize-winning physicist, concluded, when we measure something, we are forcing an undetermined, undefined world to assume an experimental value. We're not measuring the world, we're creating it. The more recent work of Nicholas Geeson, who showed that distantly separated, quantumly entangled particles each reacted to a change in the other instantly, or at least at 50,000 times the speed of light, which is as close as we can measure. And a 2007 study published in the journal Science, in which physicists showed that by the act of observation, they could retroactively change the behavior of particles, suggests to us that time and space are not, in fact, real. The past, like the future, wrote Stephen Hawking, is indefinite and exists only as a spectrum of possibilities. Perhaps most astonishing of all, in 2019, Proieto and his colleagues at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh performed a quantum experiment showing that there is no such thing as objective reality, confirming what physicists had long suspected, that quantum mechanics allows two observers to experience different, conflicting realities. So what does exist then? What lies beneath perception? What is reality, after all? The renowned cognitive psychologist and reality theorist Donald Hoffman has a one-word answer for that: consciousness. It's consciousness and only consciousness all the way down, he said. Well, if all this that I've been talking about is completely mind-blowing to you, don't be alarmed. As one of the pioneers of quantum theory once said, those who are not shocked when they first come across quantum theory cannot possibly have understood it. And this is where the cat walks into the picture, or doesn't walk into the picture, depending on the observer. You see, what Schrodinger proposed is in fact true. The cat in the box is neither alive nor dead, and it is both. Science is showing us repeatedly and consistently that reality is not about what's inside the box. It's about who or what is observing the box. Observation doesn't simply reveal the outcome, it determines the outcome. And if that holds true for the basic building blocks of what we call reality, as quantum mechanics has shown it does, would it not by necessity hold true on the larger scale as well? At the dawn of the 21st century, quantum mechanics now dares to ask the question, what if consciousness isn't just a part of the universe? What if consciousness determines the very structure of the universe itself? I'm not making this up. This is where science is now. As Martin Rees, cosmologist and president for the Royal Astrological Society, wrote, in the beginning, there were only probabilities. The universe could only come into existence if someone observed it. It does not matter that the observers turned up several billion years later. The universe exists because we are aware of it. Dr. Robert Lanza, head of Astellas Global Regenerative Medicine, an adjunct professor at Wake Forest School of Medicine and one of Prospect Magazine's top 50 thinkers, put it this way: without consciousness, matter exists only in an undetermined state of probability. Any universe that could have preceded consciousness existed only in a probability state. In his book, The Grand Biocentric Design, Lanza goes on to propose a fascinating corollary. In a chapter entitled, get this, The Impossibility of Being Dead. And remember, this is not a religious book. This is a purely scientific book. He writes, in the worldview being adopted here, there is only one consciousness, though it can be localized in a particular brain configuration and thus experience the world from that particular point of view. Alternatively, it can be localized in a different brain configuration and experience the world from that different perspective. If consciousness is everywhere and continuous, there is no death to experience. You have never not experienced consciousness, nor will this parade ever cease, though your experiences may not always be witnessed through your present eyes in your present body. Well, the impossibility of death, a grand cosmic consciousness that transcends space and time, a consciousness that generates not just life, but the universe itself. Can you see where that's going? Is it too much of a stretch, do you think, for this poor wayfaring stranger wandering in the theological wilderness to think that this just may be the first glimpse of the promised land, the place where science meets spirituality? Can you see why that's exciting to me? And might it be for you as well? Has science finally proven the existence of God? Well, maybe not quite. Certainly the scientists that I've just quoted wouldn't say so. And it's certainly not proven the God of my youth, the God who physically walked beside Abraham and talked with him, the God who spoke to Moses from a burning bush, the God of Cecil B. DeMille, or even the God of Bruce Almighty. But perhaps the mere possibility of scientific evidence pointing to a fundamental consciousness, all-encompassing, not bound by time or space, a consciousness from which the universe arose and arises and which flows through all of us, a consciousness which connects us all and binds us together, the foundation of a moral obligation between us. Well, perhaps that's close enough. And perhaps the ancient biblical author was not far off when he wrote, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God, the consciousness that modern science now suggests might underlie and infuse all of existence, that God said, let there be light. And there was light. Amen.